Ratification. The People Debate the Constitution, 1787 to 1788. By Pauline Maier. Narrated by Johnny Heller. Copyright 2010 by Pauline Maier. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Needham and Williams Literary Agency and was produced in the year 2010 by Tantor Media Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Introduction. Playing Games. This book tells a story of one of the greatest and most probing public debates in American history, one that occurred at the end of the American Revolution and involved far more than the handful of familiar founding fathers. It is the story of how we the people decided whether or not to ordain and establish the Constitution of the United States. The drama formally began on September 17, 1787, when the Constitutional Convention, or as contemporaries called it, the Federal Convention, adjourned and released to the public the Constitution it had written in secrecy. At that point, the Constitution was nothing more than a proposal. In fact, it was a proposal from a body of men who acted without authority, since the delegates had been appointed to propose changes to the Articles of Confederation, not to design a new government. The Federal Convention specified how the Constitution should be ratified, not, they said, by the Confederation Congress with the unanimous consent of the 13 state legislatures, which was required for approving amendments to the Articles of Confederation, but by special ratifying conventions elected by we the people in each of the states. And approval need not be unanimous. Once 9 states ratified the Constitution, it would go into effect among those ratifying states. Debate over the Constitution raged in newspapers, taverns, coffee houses, and over dinner tables, as well as in the Confederation Congress, state legislatures, and state ratifying conventions. People who never left their hometowns and were little known except to their neighbors studied the document, knew it well, and on some memorable occasions made their views known. What the people and the convention delegates they chose decided had everything to do with making the United States into what George Washington called a respectable nation. The most surprising thing about this book, perhaps, is that it wasn't written long ago. There are shelves of books on the Federal Convention, far more than have attempted to tell the story of ratification. In this book, the convention happens between the prologue and Chapter 1, when the delegates are leaving Philadelphia with printed copies of the Constitution in their bags. I suspect most Americans think George Washington was inaugurated a week or two after the convention, if they think about it at all. They assume ratification was automatic, which it was not. I don't mean to imply that historians have neglected the subject. Many books on the convention include a chapter or two that give a quick summary of the ratification process. There are also a handful of books that might qualify as general histories of ratification. One, which discusses both the Federal Convention and ratification, was written in German and is only now being published in translation. 2 others tell the story almost identically in books that were meant to explore the role of the Anti-Federalists or the background of the Bill of Rights, and perhaps for that reason did not tell it altogether successfully. The authors of those 2 books struggled with problems of organization with which I sympathize. It's no easy thing to tell the story of an event that happened in 13 different places, sometimes simultaneously. Other historians have backed away from telling the full story, I suspect because the documentary record is massive and widely dispersed in both central and local archives throughout the 13 original states and other parts of the Republic. Faced with an outsized subject that might demand more than a single working life to study comprehensively, historians have done what they are trained to do. They examined workable parts of the subject. Ratification in a single state, for example, one group of contenders, or the arguments made during the ratification struggle. The Federalist alone has inspired something of a small industry. Alternatively, the distinguished historians Forrest MacDonald and Jackson Turner Maine studied ratification as a whole to answer specific, limited questions. Was Charles Beard's economic interpretation of the Constitution right? Who were the Anti-Federalists? Breaking a complex topic into pieces and delegating the parts to different authors is another way of tackling outsized subjects. There are 2 fine books with chapters by different authors on ratification in each of the original 13 states. I've used those books and the other studies of ratification with great benefit, but because they look at the states separately, a lot of the story falls into the cracks between chapters. They miss the ways contenders learned from what came before, to say nothing of the tension when, as in February 1788, after the New Hampshire Convention adjourned without voting, it looked as if the Constitution's prospects could easily unravel. Or in June 1788, when, after 8 of the required 9 states had ratified, 3 major conventions met simultaneously. They missed, too, the popular excitement, which reminded me at times of Americans' obsession with the final games of the World Series, but with greater intensity, because everyone understood that the results would last for far more than a season. The analogy is, I think, appropriate, since politics was in a real sense the first national game, and the debates about the Constitution marked the beginning of American national politics. Indeed, the ratification contest was the first national election, although it was more like a series of primaries than a presidential election, since the votes were cast not on a single day but successively, in one state after another. Over and over observers tried to calculate how what happened in one state would affect what came later, which itself served to bind the nation together more tightly. One Massachusetts observer commented in November 1787 that newspapers, which were filled with news and commentary on the Constitution, were read more than the Bible at this time, which was saying something in New England. And as discussions spread from the press to taverns and homes, the arguments even involved, in a world where politics was supposedly confined to white men, women. The whole story, in short, is something more than the sum of its parts. The state ratifying conventions and the debates that surrounded the election of delegates to those conventions are at the center of the book. It describes only the beginning of the newspaper and pamphlet debates, the war of printed words, and not in great detail except where they had an obvious impact on the debates in state conventions or upon the electorates that chose delegates to those conventions. That means readers who want a careful analysis of the Federalist, for example, will have to go elsewhere. Except for the state of New York, it was less influential in 1787 and 1788 than in later times, when it was too often read as if it were a dispassionate, objective analysis of the Constitution, not a partisan statement written in the midst of a desperate fight in a critical state. At one time I worried that I might be telling the stories of a series of conventions, all of which discuss the same document. Then I remembered that Americans and other human beings spend a lot of time watching the same game, played night after night, week after week. No one game is exactly the same as the others. Similarly, the conventions in each state played out differently. To add to the interest, they all began, unlike, say, baseball or football games, with the delegates or players negotiating the rules by which they would play. It wasn't always clear, moreover, for which team some players fought, or if they were on a team at all, and every convention brought in an entirely new set of players. How a convention developed depended on the character of the state, its history and traditions, the relative strength of the contenders, the strategies they took, which were reflected in the rules they adopted, and occasionally some outside event. What happened in earlier conventions also changed the game in certain particulars for those that followed. That's why no 2 conventions were identical. Each had and has its own fascination. Each also had its own cast of colorful characters. Some of the usual suspects had roles to play, including George Washington, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Patrick Henry, even Thomas Jefferson, who was at the time in Paris, where he would witness the beginnings of the French Revolution. Others, such as James Wilson, William Findley, Rufus King, Edmund Randolph, George Mason, Edmund Pendleton, Melancton Smith, and James Iredell, are less familiar today, to our loss. But the real delights of this broad-based story, I think, are the local figures, whom almost nobody ever heard of before. Some are nameless, like the townsmen in rural Richmond, Massachusetts, who attended no fewer than 4 informational meetings before deciding that the Constitution in the form proposed was no darn good. Others are faceless. Few portraits survive of the backbenchers in the conventions, who often came out in the days immediately before the vote and expressed their convictions with a wonderful, honest eloquence. Or the portraits, as with more famous founders, are often of them as old men, which obscures how young many delegates were, in their 30s, an age when they often had to juggle responsibilities to their young families with the public responsibilities they had assumed. Participation in their state ratifying convention was, for most, their one brief part in history, what the New Yorker Gilbert Livingston called the greatest transaction of his life. The way they played their roles helps us understand why Nathan Dane, another relatively unknown person who appears in these pages, referred to Americans as an intelligent people. We owe them our attention, and they reward us richly for hearing them out. What made it possible for me in my 60s to take on this sprawling subject is a landmark editorial project, the documentary History of the Ratification of the Constitution, or DHRC, which has been published since 1976 by the Wisconsin Historical Society. There are to date 21 thick volumes in print, most of which pull together documents on ratification in individual states. The editors scoured newspapers, major archives, and even local libraries, where they sometimes found material that I suspect no historian ever used before. The size of the documentary record varies dramatically for different states. Pennsylvania received 1 volume. The records for Delaware, New Jersey, Georgia, and Connecticut together take up another. Virginia, however, required 3 volumes, Massachusetts 4, and New York 5. In the end, the DHRC lays the foundation for something of a revolution in our understanding of the ratification of the Constitution. Unlike the modern editions of the papers of Washington, Jefferson, Hamilton, and Madison, which I have also used with great profit, the DHRC documents the grassroots story of the people and the Constitution. To be sure, its volumes include hundreds of letters by the men with familiar names, but they also reproduce a collection of records that tells how the towns of Massachusetts and, to a lesser extent, Connecticut responded to the Constitution. The DHRC includes a letter that tells of a friendly fight over the Constitution at a home in Biddeford, Maine, accounts of joyful celebrations of ratification in several states, and also of the fracas in Albany on July 4th, 1788, after some 50 anti-Federalists celebrated Independence Day by burning the Constitution, which was for them a perfectly patriot act. These volumes, in short, reach down to the people and the places they lived. The project still has 5 of the original 13 states to cover: New Hampshire, South Carolina, Maryland, North Carolina, and the renegade Rhode Island. But it has completed work on 8 states, including the 4 major state conventions that marked critical stages of the ratification process: Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Virginia, and New York. I should say the editors completed work on those states, which get the lion's share of attention here in the nick of time for me. The final New York volume came out just as I was finishing the book. For the 5 states not yet in the DHRC, I had to depend on old-fashioned research and far less comprehensive documentary records. I was also more dependent than usual on the work of others. Fortunately, some of that work is magnificent. The recording of the convention debates is, I think, a part of the story of ratification, as well as one way we learn that story. In brief, shorthand men often recorded the debates for publication in contemporary newspapers, whose daily reports were later pulled together and published as books. In some states, Federalists hired individuals to record the debates for subsequent publication as books without the intervening newspaper stage. The printed debates were never exact. They gave summaries of speeches rather than complete texts and often favored the Constitution's supporters over its critics. The debates of the Pennsylvania Convention are the most extreme example. They included only the speeches of 2 leading Federalists, as if nobody else were there. Occasionally, the shorthand men simply missed parts of the debates. In transcribing their handwritten notes, they might well also have imposed a coherence on the debates that was lost to listeners, or that depended on a use of voice and gesture, and so would have been lost if spoken words were simply translated into print. By coordinating the published debates where they exist, which they don't for all states, and official journals with newspaper stories, letters, and the private notes delegates sometimes took during the conventions, the DHRC helps get around those problems. It makes it possible to tell some stories. The final part of the New York Convention, for example, that were almost impossible to tell before. The DHRC also helps historians avoid the pitfall of repeating the Federalist version of the story and their descriptions of their opponents uncritically. Let me be clear on this. I have no doubt that we need to understand the Federalist understanding of the Constitution. In many ways, they provided the intellectual foundations of American government. For that and several other reasons, good and bad, we tend to believe everything they said. From a certain perspective, they won, and winners generally tell the stories. The Federalists were intelligent and articulate, the kind of people with whom historians tend to identify and so to trust. After 200 years of stable constitutional government, with one notable and very bloody exception, it's hard to find fault with those who supported ratification of the Constitution as written. What they said seems wise and persuasive, which is to say, true. But the Federalists also controlled the documents on which historians depend. They owned most of the newspapers. They sometimes paid those who took notes on the convention debates or subsidized the publication of their transcripts. In some places, above all Connecticut, Federalists forcibly blocked the circulation of literature critical of the Constitution. In Pennsylvania, as one little-known letter in the DHRC proves, they even tried to suppress evidence that anyone had anything negative to say about the Constitution, and so to suggest that everyone was simply shouting, "Huzzah!" They were not trying to distort history. They were struggling to win a very tough fight on behalf of what they understood as the nation's welfare in a world where the rules of the political game were different from those of today. And sometimes what they said was questionable at best, that those who opposed ratifying the Constitution as written simply continued in older opposition to central government, for example, or that they were mostly state office holders worried for their jobs, or that they opposed the Constitution for some other personal reason, not from a commitment to the public good. That's getting ahead of the story, but it helps explain why I decided to use the word anti-federalist for critics of the Constitution only where it appears in quotations, almost all by Federalists, or where the designated persons willingly accepted the name, as in the upper Hudson Valley of New York. The words we use, especially names, shape the stories we tell. An anti-federalist was a Federalist term. To use the Federalist language, to tell the story in their terms, tends to give them the game, or at least to tip the story further in their direction. I make no case against other historians, including the editors of the DHRC, to whom I am greatly indebted, who refer to all people who opposed ratification of the Constitution without amendments as anti-federalists. They are following an old historical convention and will no doubt insist that they need some word for the people they call anti-federalists, which I understand. Moreover, there is some evidence that, once the ratification fight was over, anti-federalist, like Quaker or Puritan, both of which began as terms of opprobrium, lost some of its old implications. My sense, however, is that the Pennsylvanian William Findley spoke for many others in 1796, when he said that the people who raised objections to the Constitution during the ratification struggle were called anti-federalists as a name of reproach, and then added, "I do and always did treat the appellation with contempt. For that reason I preferred to type out critics of the Constitution and its synonyms over and over." I have, however, used Federalist for the supporters of the Constitution because they accepted the name, which they also invented. Even their opponents sometimes spoke of the so-called Federalists, or the Feds. I nonetheless use the term with some hesitation because it tends to suggest that there was something called a Federalist Party in 1787 and 1788, which there was not, at least not in anything like the form that emerged later, and that the fight over the Constitution was a two-sided contest between them and the opponents they called anti-federalists, which again it was not. But there's time enough to get into that. This book follows logically from my earlier work on the Revolution. I would say culminates that work, except I'm not ready to down-tool yet. I began writing about the local resistance organizations that evolved into a movement for American independence in From Resistance to Revolution, 1972, and in The Old Revolutionaries, 1980. I wrote brief portraits of the men who led that resistance. Then, in American Scripture, Making the Declaration of Independence, 1997, I described the state and local declarations of independence that preceded and made possible the familiar Declaration of Independence that the Continental Congress adopted on July 4, 1776. That long-term exploration of the local and popular foundations of politics in the Revolutionary era seems, in retrospect, to have led inevitably toward a book on the people and the Constitution. It feels almost providential that the DHRC finished publishing its volumes on the most critical states just in time to let me write that book. In the course of studying ratification, I also came to realize that few adult Americans have read the Constitution, at least since they were in high school, if then. I'll confess a personal dream that the book will make them better acquainted with the document, understanding, of course, that some provisions have since been changed. I propose a voluntary quiz after finishing the book. Readers might measure their understanding of the Constitution against that of the freemen of 18th century Belchertown, Massachusetts, who described their reasons for considering the Constitution a threat to their rights and privileges as follows. First, there is no Bill of Rights. For other reasons, see Article 1, Section 2, 3, 4, and 8. Article 2, Section 1 and 2. Article 3, Section 1, and Article 6. With many other obvious reasons. What was so obviously dangerous about Article 1, Sections 2, 3, 4, and 8? Article 2, Sections 1 and 2? Article 3, Section 1? Article 6, and though this might be too easy, about not having a Bill of Rights? Checking the Constitution is fine. There's a copy of it at the end of the book. For extra credit, what might the freemen of Belchertown have been referring to as many other obvious reasons? Finally, although the acknowledgments will come later, I need to thank the late Barbara Tuckman, whom I heard speak long ago while I was still a graduate student. One idea she proposed has remained with me over the years. A writer can build suspense in telling a story, she said, even if the reader knows how the story turned out, so long as the writer never mentions the outcome until it happens at the proper place in the story. This book, among other things, is an effort to test that theory. For the experiment to succeed, however, requires readers who are willing to play a game. They need to forget for the moment much of what they know about the American past and return in imagination to another time when there was no Constitution, when the Federal Convention had not even met, and watch events occur, step by step, unaware of how they would turn out. It's almost Christmas in 1786. An early winter ice storm had kept a retired general in Northern Virginia from collecting his mail from the nearby town of Alexandria. Now, at long last, he is ripping open a letter from Richmond. Pauline Maier, Cambridge, Massachusetts, January 25, 2010. Prologue. The View from Mount Vernon. A few days before Christmas in 1786, George Washington received a gift he didn't want. It was a letter from Virginia's Governor, Edmund Randolph, trying to pry him out of retirement. The envelope included a copy of an act passed on December 4th by the Virginia General Assembly, appointing delegates to a convention in Philadelphia for the purpose of revising the federal Constitution, and the names of 7 delegates the legislature had chosen. Washington's name stood at the top of the list. Randolph explained that the Assembly was alarmed by the storms that threatened to bring the American nation to a quick end, as its enemies had predicted. "To you I need not press our present dangers," Randolph said. As commander of the army, Washington had witnessed the inefficiency of the Continental Congress and could see the steadily increasing languor of our associated republics. Now only those who began, carried on, and consummated the Revolution could rescue America from the impending ruin. Randolph urged Washington to accept the legislature's unanimous choice of him as a Virginia delegate to the Philadelphia Convention. His appointment was not a complete surprise to Washington. He had tried to head it off in November, after James Madison, a leader of the Assembly and former member of the Confederation Congress, warned him that the legislature was going to choose delegates to the convention and that Washington's name would probably be first on the list. It was out of his power to accept such an appointment, Washington replied. A few weeks earlier, on October 31st, 1786, he had notified state chapters of the Society of the Cincinnati that he would not stand for re-election as the Society's president and would not attend its second triennial meeting, which was scheduled to convene in Philadelphia on the first Monday in May, a week before the Federal Convention would assemble in the same city. Washington gave the Cincinnati several compelling reasons for his decision. His private affairs had become seriously deranged by his long absence during the war, and they now needed his entire and unremitting attention. He was deeply and unavoidably engaged in a project to open navigation of the great rivers flowing through Virginia, and after so many years of arduous service, he yearned for retirement and relaxation from public cares. Moreover, his health was not good. He had recently suffered a violent attack of fever and ague, succeeded by rheumatic pains, such as he had never before experienced. How then could he pick up and go to the Federal Convention without offending a very respectable and deserving part of the community, the late officers of the American Army who made up the Society of the Cincinnati? In fact, Washington had another more pressing reason for backing away from his association with the Cincinnati, which he explained in confidence to Madison. When he had first agreed to head the new society in 1783, he thought of it as a fraternal organization whose main purpose was to take care of officers' widows and other dependents. Then, to his surprise, a pamphlet by South Carolina's Aeneas Burke provoked an uproar against the Cincinnati and, above all, its plan to pass membership on to the eldest sons of Revolutionary War officers. Critics such as Burke said that practice would lead to the creation of an hereditary aristocracy, which was totally at odds with the Republican system established by the Revolution. Washington accepted re-election as president at the Society's first general meeting in 1784, after it proposed several changes in its rules, including the elimination of hereditary membership. But some state chapters refused to ratify the reforms, so by the fall of 1786, as the Society's second general meeting approached, Washington found himself, as he told Madison, in a delicate position. He didn't want to seem disloyal to his fellow officers, who included some of his dearest friends and confidants, nor did he want to support an institution incompatible, some say, with Republican principles. Under the circumstances, he simply could not attend the Federal Convention in Philadelphia while the Society of the Cincinnati was also meeting there. That was his excuse, deeply felt, and to Madison, at least, clearly explained. Washington was more circumspect with Randolph. He was grateful for the honor conferred on him by the General Assembly, he wrote the governor, and in general stood ready to obey the calls of his country. However, there were at the moment circumstances that will render my acceptance of this fresh mark of confidence incompatible with other measures which I had previously adopted, and from which he had little prospect of disengaging myself. The legislature should replace him with someone on whom greater reliance can be had, since the likelihood of his non-attendance was too great. Randolph refused to take no for an answer. Neither he nor the members of Virginia's Council of State, to whom he showed Washington's letter, saw any need for Washington to withdraw immediately. It would be as easy for Randolph to appoint another delegate in Washington's place some time hence as now. Perhaps the obstacles to Washington's attendance would somehow disappear, or the national crisis would become so severe that it outweighed all other considerations. I hope, therefore, Randolph wrote, that you will excuse me for holding up your letter for the present. James Madison also urged Washington to leave the door open for later acceptance, in case the gathering clouds should become so dark and menacing as to supersede every consideration but that of our national existence or safety. Randolph and Madison played Washington like expert fishermen, and Washington, who no doubt understood full well what was going on, decided not to fight. As a result, when newspapers throughout the country announced Virginia's election of a delegation to the proposed Federal Convention, Washington's name remained at the top of the list. No American commanded admiration and trust like Washington, which was precisely why Randolph and Madison were loath to let him resign. His appointment was a mark of the earnestness of Virginia, and an invitation to other states to send their best men as delegates to the proposed convention. Indeed, by appointing a notably strong set of delegates, which included Washington, Randolph, Madison, the distinguished jurists George Wythe and John Blair, and also George Mason, who had drafted Virginia's state constitution and its influential Declaration of Rights.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?